Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is Human Potential at Work, and I'm really honored that you're joining us and watching the program or listening to the program. As a reminder, my name is Debra, and I'm the CEO of RU Global, and we are proud to be strategists and market influencers for the community of people with disabilities in the aging marketplace. Today, I'm just very honored to have my guest today. Her name is Catalina Devandas, and she is the first ever Special Rapporteur for the United Nations supporting people with disabilities. I had such an honor sitting on stage with her at the UN, talking to the COSP, the Committee on State Parties. And that was I did it once. She does it all the time. And I also am really blessed to know her husband, Stefan Trammell, who is also in this industry and has been on the show, who supports the International Labor Organization, the Global Business Disability Network. So this family is making a huge difference for our community, and I'm so honored. So welcome, Catalina, to the program.
Thank you very much, Debra. This is actually my honor to join you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, well, Catalina, tell us, first of all, about you. I know of you, and I am such a big fan of your work. And sorry, but I just love the work that you're doing, and you're impacting so many lives. But tell us, before you tell us about your position, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Well, I am a Costa Rican woman. I have a disability of my own. I am a woman with a spina bifida. I'm also a mother. I have 3 little girls, twins of almost 6 years actually. And then I have an older one that is 8. And I'm a lawyer by training. So basically that's my background. I'm based in Switzerland, Geneva now.
Yes, very, very cosmopolitan. So I think it's amazing that the United Nations appointed you in the position that you're in to make sure that people with disabilities have a louder, more visible voice. Of course, the United Nations has always been committed to human rights and making sure we're all included. I know that we are celebrating, you mentioned before we started today, the 10th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm still disappointed as an American that the United States has not ratified the CRPD, but I'm hopeful someday with the right leadership, the United States will join this. But tell us more about this position, and why did the United Nations put you in this position, and what were they hoping to achieve with your role and the team that you have working with you?
Well, thank you for the question, because the first thing that I always do when I talk to anyone or any audience is to explain what is a special rapporteur, because nobody knows, right? It sounds very fancy, but really nobody really understands what it is. But special rapporteurs, or what we call the special procedures, are independent human rights experts. And there is a body here in Geneva that is called the Human Rights Council, which is just comprised by member states, to discuss about human rights and how to advance human rights around the world. So this council designates independent experts to monitor the implementation and advancement of human rights in different areas. So you have a special rapporteur on torture, you have a special rapporteur on the right to health, you have different independent experts. So which is good is that these special procedures have been in place for more than 25 years now. And we didn't have one. We didn't have anyone focusing on the rights of persons with disabilities. And it is thanks to the convention and to the awareness that the convention brought to the international discussions that the council decided that it was needed to have someone monitoring the rights of persons with disabilities. And particularly because although there's a lot that has changed since the adoption of the convention, the challenges remain enormous. All around, countries, states around the world are struggling because they don't know, even if they want to, they don't understand really how to implement or how to make policies that are actually respecting the will, the preferences of persons with disabilities, right? So one of the things that the council thought was, we need someone that is going to monitor the advancement, but at the same time, someone that is going to be able to support the states, to give guidelines and guidance to states and say, well, look, this is something that you need to do, and this is how you can do it, right? So they created the position. They didn't create it for me or anything like that. They created this position, which is a permanent position. And by the way, is not, when we say independent, that means that we are not a staff of the UN. We are absolutely independent from the UN. We don't receive a salary from the UN. Most of the special rapporteurs are doing the work on voluntary basis. We get support from the UN to do the travel and to have secretariat support, but we are not part of the structure of the UN. And so they created this position to have someone to monitor, and then they did the selection. But the idea is, one, to help states, then to monitor rights, and then also to support people that face violations of their rights, to claim them. And so, for instance, I can receive complaints from people with disabilities around the world that I can address with the respective governments. And one important thing is that I have a universal mandate. And this is important for the reason, because you were mentioning that unfortunately the US has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I can work even with countries that have not ratified the convention. So I can call the US and say, look, we're having a problem with such and such person. So what is going on with this case, right? So it's good to have that. It's a different mandate, if I can use that word, from the one that the committee has.
Wow, I don't think I understood some of the complexities of that. So thank you for that. And when it comes to the CRPD, I have not recently looked at the numbers, but I know most countries have signed and ratified it. As a matter of fact, we're to the point now that there's so few countries that haven't ratified it. At one point, I think there was only 3 countries, but I might be incorrect, but most countries have signed and ratified it. And I know that when I write about this topic, or I speak about this topic, sometimes in the 3 books that I've written, I always begin the books with a definition of disabilities. Why should I do that when most of the countries are agreeing that the definition of disabilities would be what we have with the CRPD? But since some countries, like the United States, have not done it, I have to explain, for example, that the definition of disabilities in the land of the United States would be our wonderful Americans with Disabilities Act that we've just celebrated our 28th year. But then I have to explain, but outside the United States, we would look at the definition of disabilities by the CRPD. And that's very confusing for multinational corporations and other people that work internationally, because you have to look at through the lens from one way if you're in the United States, and other ways in the rest of the countries. And I think that's part of the reason why the United States should ratify. And also, when an American with a disability leaves the United States borders, they're not protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think that's another reason. But what are other reasons why, it's important that all of us, even the countries that have signed and ratified the convention, what can we do? I see a lot of countries trying and making efforts, and I have had some countries, including people with disabilities, say to me, well, the United Nations needs to be moving in there, and there are all these violations, and I think sometimes people get confused about the role that the United Nations is going to play when it comes to the UN CRPD. And probably with the role that you have, maybe they're turning and looking at you to be sort of the police officer of the world to solve all these problems. And I assume that's not correct.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to comment on that. First, yes, about 177 countries have already ratified the convention, and that makes it nearly universal because the UN has 194 members. So it's very good. It's a very good pace also because, I mean, it's only in the last 10 years. But the challenge is, and I think it's something that you have somehow touched on, is that the convention is important because it has a great deal of innovation. It has a whole new vision on how we need to understand and address the needs of persons with disabilities, and also who is protected by this convention, right? This question on the definition. And I try to use this as the, the broader scope of protection as possible, because especially when working perhaps with international enterprises and businesses, etc., they actually don't need to have a very narrow definition. They have to work with the most broader definition because they are actually interacting with public. They are not interacting. Sometimes the states want to narrow the definition because they have to provide benefits to people based on that definition. But when you're working with a private sector, they don't have to provide those benefits. What they have to do is to make their systems, their services accessible. And that, if it's accessible to all, it will be beneficial for the business, right? If it's inclusive for all, it will be beneficial for the business. So you don't really need to narrow, you need to open the definition, right? And the good thing is that the convention provides very clear guidance on how to do it, right? It puts the standards on what is that you need to look at and how you need to look at persons with disabilities, so that we are not looking at persons with disabilities as poor or with pity or with, like this kind of approaches, medical approaches, like patients or people that need to be treated, but instead as just regular people that is looking to participate, to enjoy, to go to the cinema, to have nice dresses, to have families. And then how do you make sure that with your activities, you're allowing persons with disabilities to be part of that? I'm very happy that this chat, for instance, it's absolutely, fully accessible for persons with disabilities, so that deaf people, blind people can follow this. How can we make sure that Nike, Coca-Cola, Benetton, and all the different parts of, airplanes, transportation are fully accessible for persons with disabilities? Because then it really doesn't make sense anymore, right? It's interesting. In the US, you might, in some areas in the US, you're very advanced, right?
Right.
And that's very fair to say. There are other areas in which you need to still work, yes. But there are things that I see for Americans are ridiculous, right? When you go outside and you see, oh my God, how is this not accessible, right? Even, entering public buildings, for instance.
Right.
Doesn't make sense, right? And you get used to that kind of accessibility. But I am traveling all around the world, and then that's definitely not the norm. I get to places where I use a wheelchair, I cannot move, right? Or in the whole country, there is only one accessible van, right? And then I feel very guilty because they give it to me because I'm the visitor, and I'm like, okay, and the person that is using this regularly, what happened to them? Are they going to school in what? How this, And so that is the reality around the world. And I think that one of the important reasons why the US should also engage in this conversation, it's because as an international donor, the US could play a fundamental role in promoting the changes in other countries. If USAID would be inclusive and say, look, we need to push for the CRPD, then countries will do it and they will receive resources for that, because there is not always a matter of resources. I always say it's not only resources, it's also approaches, but resources might also be needed, right? So we need to tackle both.
I agree. And you then brought up so many other amazing points. I am so proud to be an American. I love where I was born, where I live, but I've always had the understanding I'm a global citizen. I'm part of this beautiful, amazing world. And I'm so blessed that I get to travel. But as I travel around, and I can understand why certain Americans think we're done. We did it. We're better than everybody else. But the reality is we have so much more work to do. And also, like you said, as we evolve and we change and we do a better job of truly including people with disabilities and other disenfranchised people throughout our society, we can help other societies. And we have. I talk when I go around and I do speeches, I have this one slide where I talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and our litigation, how we put laws in place in the US and then we sue each other, and how even though that's a very messy process, at the same time, we have, by doing that, not only made our country more accessible, we've made other countries, because the multinational corporations and organizations that work in the United States trying to follow these laws then take it outside. And so for these efforts, more people are being employed outside the United States. So it's just, as you said, another opportunity for the US to continue to innovate and support. I also, as I travel around the world, and regardless of what is happening in the United States, and it's usually whatever's happening here is turned up real, high the volume because of our media, but the Americans are usually in the United States, we're usually one of the first on the scenes of helping other countries when they get in trouble. There's so much beauty in our country, but tell us, if you don't mind, how does the work that you're doing and the CRPD tie to the United Nations SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals? And I've talked a little bit about this on the show. There's 17 goals, and this is really getting a lot of attention from corporations, organizations, governments all over the world. And some countries are being very aggressive of saying, we're going to meet it, we're going to exceed it. And I think the SDGs are very important because it's about making sure we all have better lives on the world.
Yeah,
in the world.
That's a very good question. First of all, I mean, for those that are not very familiar with the UN has three main pillars. So the pillar of development, the pillar of human rights, and the pillar of peace and security. And all these three pillars are at the same level, and they should work together. And, it's like you cannot do peace without human rights or without development. And I mean, all the way around, right? So that's a fundamental thing. And of course, for persons with disabilities, we cannot forget that in developing countries, in poor countries, we have the majority of people with disabilities living in those countries. At least 80% of the world's population that has a disability lives in poorer countries for many reasons. And so how do we make sure that this new commitment of the international community to advance in the area of development, to make sure that every child has access to school, has access to health services, that they have social protection benefits, that they can have safe cities, how do you make sure that everybody benefits? And it's the slogan of the SDGs is leaving no one behind. So how we can advance in this development process without leaving anyone behind. And that is, of course, leaving no women, no child, no person with a disability, no indigenous person, etc. And this is a very huge challenge. I have the mandate to engage in these discussions. And what I've been trying to do is to make sure that the human rights pillar, it's totally connected with what it's done to implement the SDGs. So what we say is the CRPD, these rules or this legislation on the rights of persons with disabilities should guide whatever policy the governments are going to do to implement the SDGs, so that you make sure that in your policies, you don't forget about persons with disabilities. One of the things that I do when I provide guidance to states is every 6 months, I produce a thematic report. In those reports, I take particular issues that I believe that are burning issues or issues that will be key to support the states. One of them was precisely the SDGs. And so I decided to focus one on how to work on inclusive policies, right? How to design inclusive policies so that you can have some policymaker working on education or working on health or working on transportation, looking at the report and saying, okay, if I'm doing my policy on accessible transportation or in transportation in general, how do I make sure that persons with disabilities are not going to be left behind? And there are three basic rules. It's not science fiction either, right? It's like, make sure whatever you do is accessible. Mm-hmm. Make sure whatever you do is not discriminatory or discriminating against persons with disabilities. And make sure that you consultate or you engage with persons with disabilities and you participate. So you call them to the decision-making table, and persons with disabilities can give you their inputs. So it's that kind of work. We have a lot of opportunities and the big international discussions to say, look, this is how, etc. But this is, of course, perhaps the biggest opportunity that we have. And one thing that is important, and you might have mentioned that in your previous shows, is that for the first time ever in the SDGs, because we had, this is a development agenda, international development agenda. And for the first time ever, persons with disabilities were mentioned, right? Before we weren't, and so now we are. And I think this is also because of the CRPD, because the CRPD brought to the mind of the international community that we existed. And this is, I think, the great, and sometimes, and I finish with that, when we work in the UN, people think that it's so abstract. It's so in the international world. It really doesn't drop down to the communities. And for me, I understand why people think that, but I have been always making efforts to work both with the field and with the international community. And I can tell you, since the adoption of the convention, the changes around the world have been enormous. I mean, it's before and after, which is fantastic.
And that's 10 years.
Yes.
I have two questions. I'm going to ask you one first, and I'm going to let you think a little bit about the other one too. But one thing I'd like you just to talk a little bit about is when the United Nations first implemented the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the amount of countries that signed and ratified it was unprecedented. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. And the other one I want to talk about, which is a longer conversation, is understanding how many people with disabilities exist in the world is very interesting. Recently, the World Health Organization said 1 in 7 people are estimated with the disabilities. We've seen some newer studies. There's a study that has come out of the United Nations saying 1 in 5. And then, of course, here in the United States, the CDC recently put out a report tying into some of our census that 1 in 4 American adults identify as having a person with that they are a person with a disability, which is staggering numbers. I mean, we're really digging in. So, and I'll give you one more thing to think about. I know that when I had the pleasure of going to an event UNESCO put on in Costa Rica, and there were 6 of the Central American countries were there that spoke Spanish, and they were speaking about, how can these countries support each other, especially because so much of a lot of times so much of the data and the information is available in English. And of course, the United Nations wants us to consider, the United Nations language to make sure the information is out there. But a lot of it was not available in Spanish. And I know I just threw 2 humongous questions at you, so let me be quiet and give the floor back over to you.
Well, the first one is true. I mean, I think that the interest that the convention has provoked in the international community is enormous. And indeed, many countries have ratified and signed. It is also true that, and I think that this is something that we need to understand as an advantage that we have, is that this is not a highly controversial issue. Everybody wants to support the inclusion of persons with disabilities. Mm-hmm. How they do it is another question, right? But in principle, nobody will tell you, no, we don't want them to participate, at least not anymore. That's not longer politically correct, thank God. But it is true. I mean, governments and politicians and everybody, it's kind of in line with, yes, we need to do something, we have to do something. And this is also something that has built on the disability movement. The disability movement has been more active fighting for civil rights. Now I'm thinking of Yuri Human and yes, how wonderful she was and is. And how these people that were there fighting for our rights 50, 40, 30, 20 years ago, all of this is the result of what they did, right? And so we've moved a lot from that moment. And it's an easy topic. Again, the challenge here is to guide the policymakers and the companies and the private sector to understand better how these notion of embracing diversity should work. And I want to link that with what you were saying on the numbers, right? There is, of course, the need to have better data about who we are and where we are and how many we are. But this is because I think that we have to negotiate as per what is the purpose of the data, right?
Right.
I touched on that before. I mean, if you want data to know how many people lives in poverty and has a disability, and because of that requires additional financial support, then you will look for various, narrow criteria. But if what you want to do is to make sure that in general, the perception of the lives of persons with disabilities, or that we should have inclusive societies that actually embrace diversity, then the continuum increases and multiplies in a variety of ways. And then you have a lot of intersections, because you have women with disabilities, you have LGBTI people with disabilities, you have children with disabilities, you have indigenous persons with disabilities, then you can look at through all the scope. And then there's many people that have even people having significant disabilities, once they are included, they might not need benefits anymore. If you're working, if you're included, if you have a family, if you have a support network, you are just like anyone else. But in some cases, you might need the benefits. In some cases, what for me it's important in this challenge of the definitions and the numbers is to stick to what do you need the data for, first of all, for policymakers. And the second thing is, what would be really a game changer, I think, is when we shift our mentalities, when we do that, what we call the paradigm shift, I said that when we become impairment blind, then we will be doing something important, right? And that's what I said. Sometimes I use this, I like to use this when I'm talking to people, is like, if we get to be like the bar in Star Wars, when Han Solo and Luke enter into this bar full of creatures, right? It's like the mutant world, right? Everybody's different. You have all these monsters and things, and don't know what that is. And nobody cares, right? It's like you're there drinking a beer. That's all that matters, right? I think that this is what we should look. This is what I like to see for persons with disabilities, that we go there, it doesn't matter how you look, what you like, how you see, how you walk, if you hear or not, or how you look, it doesn't matter. It's just one person, right? Right. That for me will be the notion of embracing diversity, and I think that will be the real change. And some people is contributing a lot to that change.
Yeah.
In the US, you have also, I'm a fan of him, of Peter Dinklage.
Yes, I am too.
He, without doing anything particularly on the rights of persons with disabilities, he has changed the world's view on certain persons with disabilities. And that's what we need. He's sexy, he's fun, he's smart, he's talented. So
he's got everything, right?
Yeah, right.
Why would you not include him? He's amazing. And he's internationally loved. He's really, it's a wonderful example.
Yeah.
And we need more of that. And I'm very hopeful, because as you said, we're seeing precedents and change like never before. And then we have all this, which I get so excited about, the artificial intelligence and the robotics and all the innovations that's happening, and the innovations that are happening in countries. I'd heard a story, the UN had gotten involved or a nonprofit got involved to help a young girl that was hard of hearing and needed hearing aids. Somebody from a nonprofit stepped in, supported her, got her hearing aids. She started going back to school. They came back 6 months later. She was not at school anymore. And they're like, what's going on? And turns out the batteries in the hearing aids had died, and the family couldn't afford batteries. And you're like, oh, that's ridiculous that everybody can afford batteries. Well, no, they cannot. And so, somebody in the village came up with a way to do solar, solar power.
To charge them.
Yeah, and so you see such innovation coming from the developed countries, and I mean the developing countries, I should say. And I think there's so much wonderful progress. And when I go to the UN and I hear, people talking about what they're doing and where they came from, and it's just there's so much innovation, and we need that innovation to continue to make the world better for everyone, which I think is very exciting. And I think there's a lot that we've done, and like you said, there's been so much advances, but there's so much more to do. And there's so much more to do in every single country, in the leading countries, the countries that really want to make a difference working with the United Nations. There's so many opportunities for them to, get involved in these conversations. And I know I'm not seeing this as more. I would be interested because I think you live in this world that I'm about to talk about a little bit more, but there have been times when I've been brought into countries to talk about things, and I find that all the stakeholders are not at the table. A few years ago, I would notice that the people with disabilities were at the table, the governments were at the table, but there was nobody from universities or education or from corporations. And then it's different depending on where you go. But if you don't have all of the stakeholders coming together, coming up with solutions to make it work with everybody, I think that's part of the problem. Are you seeing that the stakeholders are really coming into the conversations now?
I think that that's a very good question as well, because first of all, and perhaps building on the example of innovations and technology, the development of new technologies is one of the best allies of the movement of persons with disabilities. That's no doubt, right? There's no excuse anymore. You can have the most sophisticated ways to communicate with people that before were considered unable to speak or unable to communicate. And that's fantastic, right? This is the best tool that we have. And it's now becoming cheaper and cheaper, which is also a very important thing, because it's not only the super sophisticated system for hawking, but also, something that could benefit someone else. But there are also risks in how this technology might be used and how this technology might not respond to the needs of inclusion. Because when you talk about robotics, and then I'm going to start making links with the rest of the interactions that we need to have with the different stakeholders, a lot of robotics are being used now in the technology to support and to provide support to older people, for instance, right? But then it doesn't necessarily mean, for a person with a disability, you will think, oh yeah, that gives me independence, that I don't need my PA, but for an older person, it might be absolute isolation and no human contact. When for an older person with a disability, perhaps it's far more important to have a nurse coming and nagging and than to have a robot giving you the medicine, right? So it's a different connotation. And so to really have the responses that we need to be good for the means, right? For what we want to achieve, for the goal, it's not only how we do it, but it's also what is the result of how we do it, right? It's not that we count and we say, we deliver, people has their services, but are those services actually supporting their participation, their fully, their inclusion? And for that, we need to sit together and talk. Those that are developing the technology, the different constituencies that will benefit from it. Because yes, we're benefiting a lot from the market of older people. A lot of assistive devices have been created and are cheaper because of older people. But sometimes they're only designed for older people. And then you see that there are things that are not really working for us. But you can do something that works for everybody, right? And also we need to have, as you said, the academia, we need to have researchers engaging and willing to see, oh, this is an opportunity. This is opportunity. I mean, for some people, it will be an opportunity for business. For other people, it will be an opportunity to develop knowledge. You need to have also, and this is something that is starting to happen now, is the cross-fertilization, or the fertilization across movements and human rights movements. Because we were used to discuss persons with disabilities, the women's movement, the children movement, and that's not possible anymore, right? The more you talk, the more you see like, okay, we have to talk about something easy, deinstitutionalization. Everybody agrees that we need to do. No, it's not as easy. Then you go and talk to the ones that are working on the rights of older people and the ones that are working on the rights of children. And then you will see that you really need to talk to them to make sure that what we're doing benefits all of the other groups, but also that we understand the challenges of the other groups, right? And this is also something that I've been trying to promote a lot, is like, how do we discuss the situation of older persons with disabilities? How do we discuss the situation of indigenous persons with disabilities? And that indeed, you need the universities, you need civil society, you need human rights organizations, you need the unions, right? You need the private sector to sit and say, well, this is how we can contribute to these discussions. And this is now happening more and more with the convention, because suddenly it doesn't make sense anymore. And with the leaving no one behind, I go back to the SDGs. You say leaving no one behind, and you have to have everybody in the same pot, right?
Right.
So you better talk to each other. And this is, sometimes it's challenging. And I'm myself, sometimes I get frustrated, because one of the things that we have is that nobody understands the complexities of the disability community, right? I mean, some of us think, and it's true. I mean, there are things that are because we were so isolated. Some of the notions of, just to give you an example, one human rights expert told me once that when they started discussing reasonable accommodation, they thought it was about cheap hotels.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And for us, it's like, what? Reasonable accommodation is like the basics, right? And so sometimes you have to go slower, and you have to, understand that we might need to agree on a common language, and we need to guide people. But also we have to learn from other movements. And I think that this is, and from other sectors. And I think that this is beneficial to all. And at the end, what happens when you do that is that you find that there's people that have the responses for your struggles. And they might have them for long, but they never apply it to a situation, right? So I think that that's a good thing to do.
And I'm so hopeful that we are making progress. I know that we are. And Catalina, I want to ask you the last question of how can people find about the work that you're doing? I know that you have a website and you're on social media, but I also want to say, I hope you'll please come back on the program in a few months and give us an update. But we are so blessed that you're there. Here is a woman lawyer from Costa Rica that is now in Switzerland. Your entire family is fighting for our community in ways that it's going to change billions of lives. And so I just so appreciate you and the work you're doing. And I adore your husband, Stefan. I just adore him. I'm such a fan. So, but please tell our audience, how they can find out more about your work and follow you on social media.
Well, yes, I'm very bad. This is one of the challenges we have, because, and I'm very honored and flattered for all your comments. I just think that I'm a very lucky person in the sense that I can build on the work of so many people. And so I'm only just picking what they did and trying to give some light to it, right? So it's not that I'm building this, it's just that I stand in the shoulders of so many great people. But that's fantastic, because, and also when I started the work, and I hope that whomever comes after me, because in 2 years there's going to be another person that will take on the special rapporteur. It's a term, it's a limited term of years. One of the things that I decided at the beginning was to serve as a kind of interface, right? To try to get the input and try to spread it out. But it's challenging because we struggle with the communications, right? I mean, how to spread the word out. So we have indeed the social media. You can look at Facebook as our disability, or Twitter is the same hand, SR Disability. We have a website that is embracingdiversity.net. And the website of OACHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OACHR. If you go to OACHR and then you just type Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, you will find all the information with all the reports and everything. Still, I wish we could be the Peter Dinklage, but that's another thing, right? He has another role. But I think that this kind of space is what gives us the opportunity, because on top of everything, it's complicated for us to create options to discuss with people and to, have a broader impact. So I'm very thankful to you actually for allowing me to share with your audience a little bit of what we do, and I will be more than happy and honored to join you and whenever you want to have me back.
Yes. I think that, like you said, we're all standing on the backs, the shoulders of the giants, and we all can contribute to these conversations. And I think that I have a lot of people that, working at corporations that listen to the program. They need to know about your work, the academics. We all need to know about the work you're doing, because there's a lot happening, and there's ways that we can join and make a difference in these conversations. So thank you so much for being on the program. We will definitely have you back. Special shout out to my amazing producer, Doug Foresta, and to also archive captioning. We have Wendy today behind the scenes, making sure we're fully accessible, and shout out for Chris for coming in and making sure we didn't have captioning problems. We had captioning problems last week. It was, we really, as you said, want this to be fully accessible. So Catalina, thank you for your global leadership. We are really, really grateful for that. And thank you for the audience. Thank you to the audience for helping us get this word out, subscribing to the show, passing it along, letting us know who you want to hear. But we will definitely bring Catalina back on so that she can talk more. She continues to change the world for all of us. And we're very thankful for your work. So thank you, Catalina.
Thank you very much, Debra. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye, everyone.